Welcome to the October the 19th, 1999 taping of It Happened in Grand Prairie. As we bring you the history of our city, some of the people that are making history today and some of the people that have made history in the past. And we have such a young man with us today. And I'm going to give you some information before I introduce you and see if you can help me to guess the name of this wonderful young man that is a state representative representing the city of Grand Prairie, Texas. He's a sixth-generation Texan. He is vice chairman of the Environmental Regulations Committee, a member and a past vice chairman of the Corrections Committee, and has chaired numerous subcommittees focusing on issues related to crime and punishment and the environment. He also serves on the House Administration Committee as well as the Select Committee on Constitutional Revision, and is a past member of the House Criminal Jurisprudence and Public Safety Committees. He was first elected to the state legislature in 1992 and the first Republican to serve the district in the Texas House of Representatives since its statehood. And not only all of that information, but he has had so many numerous honors, you wouldn't believe it. They include the Award of Excellence for Support for Law Enforcement from the International Police Association, the Legislative Faith Award from the Organization of the New Directions in Corrections Legislative Leadership Awards, from the Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and it goes on, and the Dallas Morning News called him a thinking man's conservative. And we call him just a jewel of an asset representing Grand Prairie, Texas in the state legislature. And we're delighted to bring, for a very special interview, the Honorable Ray Allen of District 106.
Thank you, Ruthie. And one of the things you left off of there, actually it isn't printed on the page, one of the first things that I chaired in Grand Prairie was the Community Home Improvement Commission, which you caused to be formed about 20 or 25 years ago, and it was a great honor.
And I should have had that on here, and you were on the Drug Task Force also before you went into the State House of Representatives.
I chaired that as well. It's always an honor to be with you. And,
all right.
I've enjoyed serving our citizens with you for the last decade. I wish I could have been here a little earlier and served them for the first 3 or 4 decades that you were serving people in.
That would have helped. That would have helped. This is your camera, and let's talk about some of the exciting things that you'd like to speak about today, whether it be the sex offender program, the Clean Air Act, or some new program that you're doing for new mothers that are in prison. Whatever you'd like to begin.
I might begin by just going over a couple of the highlights of the legislative session, not particularly my legislation. People in Grand Prairie usually want to know, what did all of you together do? And then they'll say, okay, now what did you do during the session? And I can answer that. I was actively involved in several of the things. But number one, we have had a $2 billion tax cut, which seems to have been lost in a lot of the discussions. But Governor Bush said we have a huge surplus. That is, we taxed people nearly $6 billion more than we needed to operate the government in this session, and we should give some of that back. And so we had a $2 billion tax cut, which is huge. We had a huge increase in monies allocated for public education, including an across-the-board pay raise for teachers of $3,000 a year. And Ruthie, you know my wife is now teaching in a Christian school here in Grand Prairie.
Yes.
I knew teachers worked hard. I have to confess, I had no idea how hard teachers work.
And Debbie was supposed to be with us today, but she has the flu.
That is correct.
Oh, man.
She is at home and not with the children, but my wife is teaching kindergarten at Shady Grove Christian School and has 20 5-year-olds all day long every day.
Isn't that exciting?
It's demanding. More, Ruthie, it's more than exciting. It is just very demanding, but she's doing well at it. And I would say she didn't get any part of the pay raise because she teaches in a private school, but teachers who teach in Texas deserve that and more.
They do.
And we should continue to keep faith with our teachers who teach our children. So I'm pleased and proud about that. We did just a number of things. We restructured the way electrical services will be delivered and billed, and I would predict to you that within another 2 years you'll have an opportunity at your home to purchase your electricity, your natural gas, your cable television, telephone, probably your computer, internet lines and alarm monitoring, and a whole range of those kinds of services that come into your home on a wire. You'll have an opportunity to buy all of those at a discounted rate on one simplified bill. And that would be your local and probably your long-distance telephone services besides, if we still have long distance when that comes around.
Yes.
Wireless telephone may wipe out long distance. It's going to be a very exciting but tumultuous environment economically for businesses in the next 4 or 5 years, and we played our part to create a regulatory environment in Texas that speeds the reduction in cost and the delivery of those services. So that was a good session for everyone in general. And as usual, I concentrated my attentions on those areas where the speaker gave me assignments, and that was in the Corrections Committee and the Environmental Regulations Committee. I do want to mention we're having a constitutional amendment election on November 2nd, and the same day we're voting on 3 major issues for the city of Grand Prairie. I served on the Constitutional Revision Subcommittee. I voted for and recommended one of the major things that's on the ballot. I think it's ballot initiative number 3, or amendment number 3, where we're going to try to cut out the deadwood of the state constitution.
I voted for that today.
Did you? Well, you did a good thing. We have, for example, in the Constitution of Texas, there is a provision that says that the governor shall call out the militia to suppress roving bands of brigands and wild Indians on the western frontier.
That needs to be out.
We really don't need that provision at this time in the Texas Constitution. We perhaps we haven't changed the ability of the governor to call out the state guard, but I don't know that we need to specify that it's only to control brigands and wild Indians. I haven't seen any since the Washington Redskins went back to Washington, and I guess they're coming back here soon. But that's why we need to clean up the state constitution, so that we make certain that our laws are not laughable to the people.
Aren't you honored to serve on the Constitution Committee?
It's a wonderful honor.
Oh, that is wonderful.
We heard many hours of testimony from people, from experts in law and constitutional law, from history professors, how our Constitution came to be, and it's one of the most interesting studies that you could possibly make. Our United States Constitution was written on one sheet of paper. It lays out in a very broad manner the structure and functions of the primary agencies of government. The Texas Constitution is 180 some odd pages long, and it specifies every possible thing that the legislators in 1876 could think of as we were recovering from the Reconstruction government following the Civil War. And they wrote a document that wouldn't ever let Yankees take over Texas again.
And you're a 6th generation Texan, so
That's
it's appropriate that you serve on this committee.
My ancestors were in Texas in 1843, and my great-great-great-grandmother, America Tucker, was born in Tarrant County, Texas in 1851.
Isn't that
I still have a
exciting?
copy of her birth records, and so it is an honor to get to work on and clean up and keep faith with the spirit of the document without leaving in the deadwood. So that's one of the things that we did. And anyway, the other issues that I worked on were criminal justice and clean air, and perhaps the issue that's been most in the news that I worked on is that of sex offenders.
Yes, okay.
We've heard quite a bit of rhetoric and discussion about sex offenders in the news media lately, and I'll just say that in 1995, 1997, and 1999, along with Senator Florence Shapiro and Senator Brown from the Houston area, I authored essentially all of the laws that are currently on the books in the state of Texas regarding sex offender registration, reporting, and the crime and punishment of sex offenders. And if you force me to summarize it, I'd just say that Texas is a place that is not very hospitable to people who continue to practice their predatory actions against women and children. We have,
And how have you clarified where we can identify them?
well, we did some things with punishment. We've doubled the punishment for people who commit rape. We've said that people who commit first-time sexual assault are not eligible to be given probation by a judge anymore. If you commit a second sexual assault, there is only one punishment that is acceptable under Texas law. That is mandatory life in prison, and I authored both of those bills. And then in the matter of sex offender registration and reporting, any person who commits any one of about a dozen sex crimes, ranging from very low-order sex crimes like indecent exposure, will have to register, and that goes all the way up to aggravated sexual assault. Some of those lower offenses, you have to be convicted more than once. For example, a person convicted of indecent exposure has to be convicted a third time before they're forced to register. That's because we didn't want to stigmatize a high school senior after a football game who has a portion of his rear end sticking out the window of a car. That's that crime. But it's also a crime that's committed by pedophiles who expose themselves to children. And if you catch them the first time they do that, that's all you can convict them of, and they are a problem. And so we wanted to have a mechanism to deal with those people who get caught early in their predatory careers, as well as to make certain that we knew where those people lived who had practiced dangerous predatory crimes. So every sex offender has to register. The lesser crimes, they have to register for 10 years. The more serious crimes require lifetime registration. They are all required to submit blood samples so that they can go into a DNA database in the state of Texas.
Now that is something that is really exciting, isn't it?
It certainly is. In fact, in Granbury, Texas, where my wife grew up, by the way, we had two little girls who were sexually assaulted by a total stranger. He got away with the crime, but they collected forensic evidence from the little girls. And about 3 years later, right after we created this DNA database, we started matching forensic evidence from unsolved crimes with samples from the database that was collected from people who were in prison. And we found the guy who raped those two girls. He was in a county jail in the state of Texas and had been forced to give a blood sample. He admitted his crimes, at the time claiming, this is the only time I ever did that. About a year later, when we continued matching evidence, we found that he had raped another little girl 2 years prior to that. And we still don't know how many children were that man's victims. So now we're building a database that's going to make it very difficult for these people to escape without the full weight of the law following their actions.
I imagine that was probably the highlight of your life when that passed in the legislature.
It was one of them. And let me just tell you the best moment I've had as a representative in terms of my work.
Yes.
My family, frankly, is more gratifying than this work, though this is the best work I've ever had in terms of personal gratification. But this last session on a Friday morning, I picked up my newspaper, I think it was the Star-Telegram, and I was reading through and I saw there was an article about the sentencing of a sex offender. It happened to be the case of the young man who was in West Grand Prairie who was using Beanie Babies to lure little children into his home right across from elementary school. He was tried, he was convicted, and after he was convicted, the jury met to assess his sentence, a sentencing portion of the trial. And then I was reading the paper the morning following his sentencing, and the jury sentenced him to life in prison, mandatory life. And I remember reading, toward the end of the article, one of the jurors who remarked to the reporter, "I certainly was surprised to discover after we found him guilty and started studying how we would sentence him that only one sentence was available, that sentence being mandatory life in prison." I called my staff. I said, "Scott, get in here. Myra, get in here. Look at this.
This is it.
This is the law we wrote. We put that law in the books." And that predator who's been attacking little children in Grand Prairie, Texas, is in prison today, and he's not going to come out of prison. He's going to stay there. So I was pleased about that. And I'm not taking joy in the fact that I am mean or tough. but I'm taking joy in the fact that the people of Grand Prairie gave me this job nearly 7 years ago and said, you do something about crime. And
I have a
think I've kept
granddaughter
the faith.
that uses the internet, and she has found the sex offenders that are listed in the Grand Prairie area near where she lives.
Right, and I authored that bill
and
as well.
that's because of you.
Yes, I wrote that. Actually, in order to get that to happen, I've passed 4 bills over the course of nearly 7 years, each of which allowed us to make incremental progress toward putting this information out to the public in a form that the public can easily use, while not creating an atmosphere that invites vigilantes. That is absolutely wrong. We're not putting this information on the internet to invite people to go attack their neighbors, even if they are sex offenders. That is against the law, and people who do that will go to prison and live with sex offenders. So we're trying to provide accurate information so that parents of children can make good decisions about how they best can protect their own children in their own homes.
There's 2 things I want to talk about. But I know one of these is going to be an assignment from the governor for you on the Texas Clean Air Act.
Yes.
But I also want to talk just a little bit about the Teenage Mothers Parenting and Mentoring Program. Now, that sounds really exciting.
Well, we have a number of mentoring programs going on around the state because we have finally realized the persons who wind up in prison generally are people who, when they were children, were not adequately parented, weren't nurtured, weren't cared for, weren't fed, weren't educated. They're mostly neglected children. And if we could find ways to take care of those children, not with some big government program, but with people of faith and charitable institutions in the community, we might be able to avoid spending billions of dollars to incarcerate them later. So that's kind of the background here. We had last year in the Texas Youth Commission, which is our juvenile prison, we had 14 young women who, when they arrived there, arrived pregnant. And in past years, what has happened is those young mothers give birth, and 1 day later, the child is put into foster care, and the girl goes back to her normal prison.
1 day?
1 day. And goes back to her normal prison regimen. The child goes into foster care, the girl goes through her prison regimen for the next year or 2 years, and when she comes out, she has not given up her parental rights, and so the child, which was taken away 3 years ago, is now taken out of a foster care family where the child has built relationships and bonding and all of those things, and given back to a stranger who is its biological mother, who has no training in parenting skills, no effective job training, and we start the cycle all over again. And what I tried to do with one bill this session was an experiment, and I hope it'll work. I don't know if it'll work, but I'm trying to, with this experimental bill, break that cycle. And so what we've done is we've said if a young girl comes in pregnant, we're not going to put her in the regular prison. We're going to put her in a secure environment like a prison, but that doesn't have a prison atmosphere. And when she gives birth, we're going to let the baby stay with her, bring in her extended family, and teach her how to mother her child. At the same time, make sure that she gets a GED, make sure she gets vocational education so she can make a living and take care of her child and not go on welfare. And when she has finished with her sentence, or 3 years, whichever comes first, she and the child will leave that secure environment together.
And be bonded.
Hopefully have an opportunity to make a solid life. And if it works with these 14 girls, then we'll perhaps try it in a larger experiment with adults. There's one prison that I'm very familiar with because of another program I created in it, but we have 500 women in a prison in Lockhart, Texas. Those 500 women have 1,600 dependent children who are living at home, and the mothers are all in prison. And so when you start looking at these kinds of things and say, okay, my job is to stop crime in the present and in the future and to stop it from growing, you realize that just building more prisons might not be the very best answer for every situation. Now, I've helped build a lot of prisons, 100,000 beds, but I'm saying that it probably has come time for us to try to do some things, spend our money in some ways that are tougher and smarter, and so that's why I'm trying to do some of those things.
How about this clean air business?
We're
We're in bad trouble,
We're
aren't we?
breathing dirty air in North Texas.
Yes.
It is affecting people's health. Increasingly obvious that people who have asthma and other respiratory ailments are in trouble because of ozone, which is created by three sources, Ruthie. Industrial ozone emissions, which accounts for about 11% of all of our air pollution in North Texas. Construction equipment, and your lawnmower and mine, and our leaf blowers and weed eaters. When you combine those things with the non-road sources that move around, not cars, not trucks, but heavy equipment and really light equipment, that's 38% of our air pollution.
Oh, it is.
38%. And over 50% of it is our automobiles. Now, in the last session of the legislature, I authored a bill that created a permitting system for one group of industrial polluters called the grandfathered facilities. Those were primary electric power generators and industries. We are getting them to reduce their ozone statewide by between 35 and 50%. Some of them are going over 50, some are making reductions of 35%.
Is this mandatory?
Part of it is mandatory, part of it is a program where you can volunteer in. You're not required to make the cuts, but once you volunteer in, everything else is mandatory. And we now have volunteers who have volunteered to make cuts of 1/3 of the total grandfathered pollution in the state of Texas is already covered by volunteers. So we're making rapid progress there. Remember, that's 10% of the problem, and we've probably got that cut in half. But we still have all of the non-road mobile sources, the heavy equipment, construction, all of that, and our cars. And here's what's pressing us, both the growing impact of health effects and the threat by the Environmental Protection Agency to cut off all of our highway funds for the state of Texas. That has two impacts. Number one, it creates an inconvenience for us to travel around if we can't build roads. But the second is, if you can't build enough roads, then traffic slows down and our rush hours go from 1 hour to 3 hours.
Much more pollution.
Exactly. Cars who already pump out more than half the pollution are sitting there idling on a major highway, and so we can't allow that to happen. Our county judges from multi-county region have been meeting along with state and local government, and we're cooking up a plan right now to make those reductions, but we should tell the people of Texas that we've made industry contribute more perhaps than their fair share, and both your local elected officials, the councils on government, and the state legislature are going to be put into a position where we're going to have to come to people who are driving automobiles and people who are running construction equipment. We're going to have to get you to tell us how we can clean up our air. You may have read the newspaper that the city of Houston is now the dirtiest air city in the nation, surpassing Los Angeles. And Dallas is about to be named as a severe non-attainment area, which is the status Houston had a year ago. So we're going to have to do something about that, and I do not see an easy answer for that.
Is that your next job, tackling that in the next session of the legislature in 2001?
I hope not, Ruthie, because the legislator that passes laws that restrict people's transportation is not going to be a popular fellow.
Not popular at all, is it?
I wasn't very popular when we brought industry sources up and said, we're going to write a set of laws and we're going to ask you to volunteer in before 2001. And if you don't volunteer in, then you're going to face a very uncertain future. So why don't you volunteer now? That's kind of my voluntary program, is I'm going to give you 2 years to volunteer in, and after that you're going to have to make adjustments. So the good news is that companies are stepping forward. We've cut the total amount of industrial pollution by grandfather facilities by more than 1/3 with volunteer commitments from about 65 companies, and more are coming on all the time. The electric power generators have cut their emissions by 50% in the criteria pollutants that we're concerned about. And Ruthie, clean burning engines for automobiles are in the pipeline. Detroit is inventing them and perfecting them now, but they're not going to get here. The first model year that will have the clean burning engines is 2004. and it'll take about a decade until everybody owns one of those types of engines. So we have about a 15-year time frame here where we're going to have to do some other things, or people literally will be in hospitals and our highway funds will be cut off. So that's the tough one, and we're finally down to the point where there's no simple solution. And I'm taking this opportunity to tell people, watch, it's coming. We're going to have to do something in North Texas.
Yes, and we have 3 minutes left on our interview. I want you to talk just a little bit about your wife, your 5 children, and your 6 grandchildren.
And we're seventh on the way.
And the 7th on the way.
That's
we wanted to get into a little personal there, because the people in our viewing audience want to know about a fine young man such as you are.
Well, I can't tell you how flattered I am that you're still thinking of me as young. I'll be 49 on my birthday later next month, so I'm just hovering right there where it's going to be hard to call me really young anymore.
Yes.
Debbie and I have 5 children. We have 6 grandchildren. We're raising one of the grandchildren at home, who's a 6-year-old, and that's an interesting thing to have a 6-year-old and be nearly 50 yourself, but I love that. And a new grandbaby on the way. You know the mother and the father. The people don't know that we're really relatives, Ruth. You have a nephew, and I have a son-in-law who's the one and the same. And Jamie and Melissa are expecting their 3rd child in 8 months or 7 months.
That's exciting.
One thing we didn't mention legislatively. I know I'd rather talk about my family, but one of the bills that I authored cleared the way for us to have 3 propositions on the ballot for local economic development.
Yes.
And I wanted to say...
And that's Grand Prairie, Texas.
Yes, Grand Prairie, Texas. This was a bill that was requested by the City Council and the Mayor of the City of Grand Prairie, our Chamber of Commerce, and our Economic Development people. I authored the bill. It's passed. And we're now having those elections. We're going to have an election to see if we have a world-class auto racing facility in Grand Prairie and continue our economic growth pattern that we set with Lone Star Park. We're going to have another proposition that creates a wonderful, exciting golf and luxury hotel development in far south Grand Prairie, and that will create enough money for us to put in the infrastructure, the sewer lines and the water lines and streets and those kinds of things. And finally, perhaps the most important thing is that we're going to have a huge election to decide whether we're going to have the very best parks system in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex for the quality of life of Grand Prairie. We have such a wonderful city and such a large amount of undeveloped land. It would be absolutely a shame to pave it all and ruin this beautiful city. So here's an opportunity for the people of Grand Prairie to let others who come into our entertainment events pay their sales tax and give it to the city of Grand Prairie so that we can build parks for our children and grandchildren. The vast majority of the money that would pay for these projects wouldn't come from people in Grand Prairie, but from people who are visiting Grand Prairie. And I think for my judgment, that is an excellent bargain we should strike. So I'm glad to play a part in that.
I am so glad you have authored that bill. We have an opportunity to not let Grand Prairie be passed by, as many of our city leaders let us be passed by in the past, not give you a long list of the things we've lost because we didn't have farsightedness. Thank you. Your honor.
Thank you,
It was
Ruthie.
wonderful to have
It's
you
good
with
to be
us.
here.
And this is Ruthie Jackson reminding you that history is as we live and do.